Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The question I am trying to answer with this lecture is the question, what's wrong with images? Modernity begins almost 3,500 years ago with the prohibition to worship wrong gods or God in the wrong way. The iconoclastic impulse against false representations is the hallmark of enlightenment, rationality, and modernization. The Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten seems to have been the first in history to get this idea through with considerable force in the middle of the 14th century BC by abolishing the entire Egyptian pantheon, closing the temples and feasts, and firing the priests. In Egypt, this move towards modernity stayed an episode of at most 20 years, but in Israel with Moses, it gained ground with consequences that eventually changed the world more radically than any political or technological revolution. Until then, mankind lived in the fear of neglecting any important deity. Now, the much greater fear seized them to worship false gods and to fall into idolatry or heresy. The revolutionary idea of religious falsehood, of false gods and wrong religion, finds its clearest and most radical expression in the second commandment. Thou shalt not make for thyself any graven image. The graven image is the paramount and symbol of wrong religion. The prohibition of images and its underlying distinction between truth and falsehood means the beginning of the era of Western modernity in which we are still living. But what could have been its original meaning? Why forbidding images? What's wrong with them in the eyes of God? And what do we learn about the concept of image from the fact that God forbids the making and the worshipping of them? Let us first recall the text. So I read the text, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. The prohibition of images is the only commandment that receives an explanation. Thou shalt not make thyself images, because God is jealous, and he distinguishes between his foes, the image worshippers, and his friends who abstain from worshipping images. Images rouse the jealousy of God because they attract worship, and thus distract men from exclusively worshipping God, who does not tolerate any other gods beside him. God considers images to be other gods and his rivals. The text does not refer to specific images, for instance, cult images of other gods, but to images of whatsoever. Every image that represents something counts as another god that rouses God's jealousy. We must not forget that we are here in a world, to quote Hans Belting, before the age of art. Images are not made for aesthetic pleasure, for decoration and embellishment, but for worship. Worship is the only raison d'être for the production of images. Moreover, we are in an enchanted world, a world full of gods, and in this world of divine immanence, every image has the power to turn into a god. Images are prohibited because they are all too powerful. They enchant or divinize the world. To prohibit the production of images, therefore, means to prohibit the adoration of the visible world. The visible world in its shapes and forms must not be adored, and in order to avoid this mistake, it must not be represented in images. The composer Arnold Schönberg, when working on his opera Moses and Aaron, has given a very convincing interpretation of this aspect of the second commandment. Images, he writes, are false gods. I'm just reading the English translation. There's a false god in everything that surrounds us. He can look like everything, he originates in everything, everything originates in him. He is like the entire surrounding nature, and nature is in him as in everything. This God expresses the worship of nature and identifies every living creature with God. There is, however, yet another explanation of the prohibition of images in the Bible that gives it a very different meaning. And this explanation is to be found in the book of Deuteronomy. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully. Since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire, beware lest you act corruptly by making a carved image for yourselves, in the form of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any animal that is on the earth, the likeness of any winged bird that flies in the air, the likeness of anything that creeps on the ground, the likeness of any fish that is in the water under the earth. And beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are this day. God is invisible. Therefore, he cannot be worshipped in anything visible, be it an image or a heavenly body. It is interesting to know that images are here given the same status as sun and moon and stars. The visible forms, especially the heavenly bodies, are given to the other nations as objects of worship. They are the gods of the others. They must not be worshipped by Israel, who has acquired a special status, where anything visible is banished from communication with God. This explanation does not refer indifferently to images of whatsoever, but only to images of God, that is, images that are meant to represent God. Yahweh, the God of Israel, must not be represented in an image because he is invisible. Here, the prohibition of images is not so much a matter of loyalty, of not worshipping other gods, but of not worshipping God in the wrong way. Both meanings amount to a rejection of, or an exodus from, the enchanted world. Both meanings, in the first meaning, it is man who is called upon to extract himself from the pitfalls of word enchantment by abstain from image making. In the second meaning, it is God himself who is emancipated from any intramundane representability. Let us keep these two meanings apart by calling the first one political, because it is a matter of loyalty and commitment, and the second one theological, because it is based on a theological statement, the invisibility and extra-mundaneity of God, transcendence. The first meaning is supported by the context, not only because the prohibition of images is a commentary on the prohibition of other gods, but also because it is followed by an explanation stressing the jealousy of God and his distinction between friend and foe. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. This is an unequivocally political commentary. God resents the making of images as an act of defection and apostasy. This shows the political of images to be at least originally the dominant interpretation. The prohibition of images divides the world into two parties, the idolaters and the iconoclasts. The first being the enemies and the second being the friends of God. The second, the theological interpretation, is supported by Deuteronomy's emphasis on the invisibility of God. Images are thus forbidden for two reasons. A, because every image represents a false god. This is a question of loyalty. Images are other gods and provoke God's jealousy. And B, because no image is able to represent the invisible God. This is a question of God's nature. Given the invisibility of God, image is the wrong medium to establish a contact with the divine. The concept of medium leads us to a next step. If images are the wrong medium, is there an alternative? Is there a right medium of establishing a contact with God, or does the prohibition of images throw us into an abyss of negative theology? This second possibility was in fact the position of Arnold Schönberg, who in his opera Moses and Aaron interprets the prohibition of images in an extremely radical way. Moses condemns not only the golden calf, but the whole Bible as an image, wrong as an image can be. His Moses despairs at the end of the opera, at the end of the second act, which is in fact all that Schönberg composed. So Moses despairs at this end of the communicability of any idea of God, not only through images, but also through words. He collapses with the cry, O Wort, du Wort, das mir fehlt. O word that I am missing. This is the end of Schönberg's Particelle, an extract score. This radical position of negative theology, however, does by no means correspond to what the Bible intends by the prohibition of images. The Bible luxuriates in verbal images of God, and these are obviously fully admitted. There's nothing wrong with language. Schönberg's Moses calls God not only invisible, but also unimaginable. This does not correspond to the biblical view. On the contrary, imagination is everything. The biblical texts constantly invite us to imagine God, to form mental images of God in order to love Him, to fear Him, to obey Him. The visible images must disappear in order to make room for the word and the mental images it evokes. Where image is, shall Torah be. Where Torah is to be, images must disappear. However, the path to negative theology is paved by the second commandment. As its ultimate consequence, it leads to rejecting not only material, but even mental images of God. Between the two meanings of the prohibition of images, the political and the theological one, lies a shift in orientation, in religious orientation, which may be described as a shift from monolatry to monotheism. Monolatry means the exclusive worship of only one God in a world supposed to be full of other gods. Monotheism, on the other hand, recognizes only one God and negates the existence of other gods. In the context of monolatry, images are forbidden because they constitute other gods and their cult amounts to apostasy. In the context of monotheism, they are forbidden because their visibility precludes any contact with the true invisible God. The theological explanation that is given in Deuteronomy chapter 4 belongs to a later stratum of the text when Israel has already made the move from monolatry to monotheism. Let us now have a look at what may be counted as the primal scene of idolatry, the forbidden worship of images, namely the story of the golden calf. As is told in Exodus chapter 32. Moses climbed on top of Mount Sinai and stayed there for 40 days. Now I read, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us." And as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are on the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hands and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Meanwhile, Moses on Mount Sinai is warned by God that the people is committing great crimes. God wants to destroy the people and to found with Moses another one, but Moses prevails on him to forgive and give his people a second chance. So this is Poussin, of course, dance around the golden calf. This is Rembrandt, a well-known painting. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back they were written. The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. And as soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets out of his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. Moses destroys both the tablets and the calf, the one out of anger and the other as a humiliation and punishment. What could be the meaning of grounding and diluting the golden calf and of making the people swallow it? Eating the sacred animals is, in the Egyptian imaginaire, the worst religious crime possible. Drinking the diluted calf seems the equivalent of eating sacred animals. Again, we meet a strange power which is attributed to images. Images are treated as sacred animals in the Egyptian sense, not as representations, but as incarnations of the divine, of false gods, not as copy of a divine body, but as divine bodies themselves. And their consumption by drinking is perhaps meant as an act of desecration. But this is not enough. Moses also orders a massacre. And then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered around him. And he said to them, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp. And each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor." And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses. And that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. The execution of this punishment is presented as a model of zeal. Human zeal and divine jealousy are in Hebrew expressed by the same word, kinah. El-Kana means the jealous God. Kanaim is the denomination of the zealots. Moses and the Levites act as Kanaim and making themselves tools of God's jealousy. This is what zealot means. The Arabic word for zeal is Hamas. The story teaches that God's distinction between friend and foe prevails over human bonds of kinship and friendship. The sin of the golden calf is not a matter of disloyalty, but of false theology. They did not want to leave Yahweh alone and turn to other gods, but to replace the vanished representative, Moses, with a representation of God to lead them to Canaan. They wanted the calf as an image of God, and this was their mistake. The golden calf was not meant to be another god. but it turned out to be a false way to God, a false God, dead matter. The God of Israel is not only invisible, he is also transmundane. The world of monotheism is disenchanted and de-divinized. In a disenchanted world, images are unable to establish any contact with the divine and turn into mere matter, gold, silver, stone, wood. Thus we read in Psalm 115 of the nations, and their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands. They have mouths, but they don't speak. They have eyes, but they don't see. They have ears, but they don't hear. They have noses, but they don't smell. They have hands, but they don't feel. They have feet, but they don't walk. Neither do they speak through their throat. Those who make them will be like them. Yes, everyone who trusts in them. Israel, trust in Yahweh. He is their help and their shield. We meet here with the concept of paganism, which monotheism constructs as its own counter-image. Unlike monolatry, monotheism draws the distinction between true and false religion and condemns all other religions as false, that is, pagan. The concept of the jealous God, and thus the original meaning of the second commandment, belongs to the stage of monolatry and does not reject the foreign gods as false and the other religions as paganism. They are simply forbidden for Israel. Monotheism, on the other hand, develops a universalist perspective where there is only one true God and where other religions that do not recognize the true God walk in the darkness of paganism. The hallmark of false religion or paganism is idolatry, the worship of images. Other and much longer examples of such invectives against foreign religions are Jeremiah chapter 10, Utrecht, Isaiah chapter 44, and Wisdom of Solomon chapters 12 through 14. These texts give a new answer to our question, what's wrong with images? Images are just helpless matter, pieces of wood or stone without the power to help themselves, let alone others. The ancient Egyptians and Babylonians held, of course, totally different views about the nature and power of images. They distinguished carefully between a statue and a god. An image becomes a medium for establishing a contact with the divine only after complex rites of consecration and investiture, only temporarily, only within the spatial, temporal, and social frames of the cult. The most explicit theory of the cult image appears only in a much later Egyptian text, which is written in the 3rd century AD in view of rising Christianity, the Hermetic treatise Asclepius. This text devotes several chapters to the statues, quote, animated and conscious, filled with spirit, and doing great deeds, statues that foreknow the future and predicted by lots, by prophecy, by dreams, and by many other means. Statues that make people ill and cure them, bring them pain and pleasure as each deserves. Images are not dead matter, but are vessels of divine presence. They provide an interface between the divine and the human worlds, between heaven and earth. Do you not know, the text continues, that Egypt is an image of heaven, or, to be more precise, that everything governed and moved in heaven came down to Egypt and was transferred there? If truth be told, our land is the temple of the whole world. Images are the means of bringing the divine down and making it dwell in Egypt. Images, in the eyes of those who believe in them, let us call them iconists, achieve precisely the same what they prevent in the eyes of the iconoclasts, making God dwell among the people and ensuring sacred communication. Images and sacred animals are media of divine immanence. Iconoclasm would bereave the world of this divine animation and would turn it into mere inanimated matter, doomed to pollution and decomposition. The Hermetic treatise continues by giving a vivid description of what it calls the old age of the world. Senectus mundi. Divinity will return from earth to heaven, and Egypt will be abandoned. The land that was the seat of reverence will be widowed by the powers and left destitute of their presence. Then this most holy land, seat of shrines and temples, will be filled completely with tombs and corpses. A torrent of blood will fill the Nile to the banks and pollute the divine waters. Whoever survives will be recognized as an Egyptian only by his language. In his actions he will seem a foreigner. In their weariness, the people of that time will find the world nothing to wonder at or to worship. This universe, a good thing that never had, nor has, nor will have its better, will be endangered. People will find it oppressive and scorn it. They will not cherish this entire world, a glorious construction, a bounty composed of images in multiform variety, a multiform accumulation taken as a single thing. No one will look up to heaven. The reverent will be thought mad, the irreverent wise. Whoever dedicates himself to reverence of mind will find himself facing a capital penalty. They will establish new laws, new justice. Nothing holy, nothing reverent, nor worthy of heaven or heavenly beings will be heard of or believed in the mind. How mournful when the gods withdraw from mankind. Then neither will the earth stand firm, nor the sea be sailable. Stars will not cross heaven, nor will the course of the stars stand firm in heaven. Every divine voice will grow mute in enforced silence. The fruits of the earth will rot. The soil will no more be fertile, and the very air will droop in gloomy lethargy. Thus, such will be the old age of the world: irreverence, disorder, and disregard for everything good. The worship of images is a worship of the cosmos, or, to use a word coined in the 18th century, cosmotheism. Images are not mimetic reduplications of visible reality, but vessels of the invisible, intra-mundane powers that animate the world from within. In the view of the Iconists, images idolize the world and blind the eyes for looking beyond the world and focusing on the creator instead of the creation. Instead of establishing a contact, images block the communication with God, whose presence can only be felt like, to quote Stefan George, air from other planets blowing. For the Iconists, the divine is not like air from other planets blowing, but the very air that is blowing in this world, and that makes it an abode habitable for both man and gods. To the Iconists, this happiness with and within the world as it is appears like blind entanglement. Idolatry means Weltverstrickung, entanglement within the world, addiction to the visible and the material. In the last part of this lecture, I propose to have a look at what became of the prohibition of images in Occidental Christianity. Christianity readmitted the images of the visible and even images of the invisible. With its incarnation in Jesus Christ, the world became visible and left even an imprint on the handkerchief of Veronica, whose name means true image, Vera Icon. In the history of monotheism, Christianity meant a huge iconic turn. However, the Ten Commandments stayed valid, and among them the prohibition of images and the incrimination of idolatry. The writings of the Church Fathers are full of violent invectives against the idolaters. Idolatry is treated as madness, as illness, a kind of addiction, and a satanic performance. The traces of Christian iconoclasm are to be seen everywhere in Egypt, for instance. Occidental Christian history is thus informed by a deep conflict between iconism and iconoclasm, between a culture of the word and a culture of the image. After the first iconic turn in late antiquity, there was a drawback in form of the Byzantine iconoclasm, which lasted for a century until the conflict was finally solved in favor of images. A similar wave of iconoclasm occurred with the Reformation. Sculptures, paintings, and even organs were removed from Protestant churches and to a large part destroyed. On the other hand, the Reformation led to an enormous boom of word culture, of writing, printing, and reading, of teaching and preaching, of philology and hermeneutics. With the Counter-Reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries, however, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction, and we see another iconic turn, triumphantly setting in, especially in the Catholic countries of the South. The Enlightenment of the 18th century and the beginnings of bourgeois culture, however, show many traits again of an anti-iconic world culture. Until this day, the intellectual history of the West is torn between iconism and iconoclasm, a culture of the image and a culture of the word. Heinrich Heine gave a vivid expression of this double-facedness of European modernity. I read first the German and then in English translation. Menschen sind entweder Juden oder Hellenen. Menschen mit asketischen, bildfeindlichen, vergeistigungssüchtigen Trieben oder Menschen von heiterem, entfaltungsstolzem und realistischem Wesen. So all people are either Jews or Hellenes. People with ascetic and iconoclastic instincts who are addicted to intellectualizing, or people of a sunny and realistic temperament who take pride in their own organic growth. Note the irony. Jewish asceticism is presented as a matter of instinct and addiction, and Greek pride and serenity a matter of temperament. Sigmund Freud held similar ideas about Judaism and its proneness to spiritualization. In his last book, Moses and Monotheism, he outlines his ideas about monotheism as an advance in spirituality or intellectuality, Geistigkeit, that is, in word culture, and sees in the Jewish people the paragon of this movement. The Jews owed this advantage in intellectuality to the prohibition of images, which forced them to turn away from the sensual and to concentrate on the intellectual. Sigmund Freud, among the precepts of the Moses religion, there is one that is of greater importance than appears to begin with. This is the prohibition against making an image of God, the compulsion to worship a God whom one cannot see. In this, I suspect, Moses was outdoing the strictness of the Aten religion, or Echnaton, from where we started. Perhaps he merely wanted to be consistent. His God would in that case have neither a name nor a countenance. Perhaps it was a fresh measure against magical abuses, but if this prohibition were accepted, it must have a profound effect. For it meant that the sensory perception was given second place to what may be called an abstract idea, a triumph of intellectuality over sensuality, or strictly speaking, an instinctual renunciation, Triebverzicht, with all its necessary psychological consequences. In his Kritik der Urteilskraft, Immanuel Kant interpreted the prohibition of images 150 years earlier already in a very similar way. There is perhaps no passage, Kant wrote, more sublime in the Jewish law code than the commandment, you shall not make for thyself any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is in the earth beneath, etc. This commandment alone is sufficient to explain the enthusiasm which the Jewish people in its more civilized epochs felt for its religion, or even that pride which is inspired by Mohammedanism. In the last decade of the 18th century, when Kant wrote his third critique, the sublime ranked as the central category of aesthetics. The sublime is the opposite of the beautiful. Whereas the beautiful appeals to the senses and attracts humans to the visible and the sensual world, the sublime transcends our sensual and conceptual capabilities of comprehension. It repels the senses and tears humans away from their everyday entanglements. exposing them to the horrors of the unknown and leading to a transformation and sublimation of their nature, which reminds us of Freud's concept of sublimation. This leads to a totally different conception of the power or impotence of images. What's wrong with images? They lure the mind into sensual attractions and lead to cultural regression. In his later days, Goethe seems to have fostered similar opinions about images and image culture. In one of his Zahme Xenien he wrote, I read in German, dummes Zeug kann man viel reden, kann es auch schreiben, wird weder Leib noch Seele töten, es wird alles beim Alten bleiben. Dummes aber, vors Auge gestellt, hat ein magisches Recht. Weil es die Sinne gefesselt hält, bleibt der Geist ein Knecht. So silly stuff may be said enough, it also may be written. This will kill neither body nor soul, nothing will be changed. Silly stuff, however, put before the eyes, raises a magic claim. Since it keeps the senses enthralled, the mind is made a slave. This sounds as if Goethe were writing in and against the age of television and advertisement. What's wrong with images? Their magic claim. What Goethe calls their magic claim is the kind of constraint they are exerting on our imagination as long as they operate outside language and verbal reflection. A verbal statement may be answered by ways of rejection, elaboration, modification, or making a counter-statement. But how to answer images? This is precisely what we have to learn in order to escape their magic claim and their power to enslave the mind. The solution seems to be not the prohibition of images, but the acquisition of iconic literacy. Paul Auster once wrote, "The world enters us through our eyes, but we cannot make sense of it until it descends into our mouths." Images and sound surround and invade us in the form of a largely unconscious sphere. Only by the constant labor of linguistic articulation and formulation are we able to transform at least parts of the sonic and iconic environment into the sphere of consciousness. And only under this condition are even sounds and icons able to function as carriers of meaning and means of word articulation. Thank you for your